On the land of Ikenga, life was divided by the color of your clothes. The royals, dressed in purple and white, lived in a world of comfort and ease. They adorned themselves with gold, feasting every day, their lives filled with music, laughter, and endless celebration. Their palaces stood tall, shining under the sun, while their tables were never empty. But for the peasants, life was nothing like that. The peasants wore rough sackcloth, and their days were long and hard. From the moment the sun rose, they worked. In the fields, they tilled the soil, planting and harvesting crops that they would never taste. In the royal chambers, they scrubbed floors and cleaned, always under the watchful eyes of the royals. Their work ended only when the sun set, and they would return to their small, humble homes, tired and worn out. There was no rest, no joy, only the endless cycle of labor. The two worlds of Ikenga never mixed. It was even a sin for a peasant to smile at a royal. The royals, in turn, treated them with cruelty. A harsh word, a slap, or even a whip, these were common. The peasants were not seen as people, but as tools to be used and discarded. Soldiers, known as the king's hands, were everywhere, watching. They made sure the peasants stayed in line, working from sunrise to sunset. Anyone found outside the fields after dark was hunted down. There was no mercy. This was the way things had always been in Ikenga, a kingdom where one group lived in endless joy, while the other could only dream of a better life, their hope buried under years of suffering. In the kingdom of Ikenga, every peasant worked in the fields. From sunrise to sunset, their hands were rough from toil, their bodies weary. But there was one exception: Swalli. Swalli was a young, beautiful girl, hidden away by her two elder brothers. They feared for her safety, for the royals had no mercy on peasants, especially the women. Every morning, her brothers would give her a dirty old smock to wear and lead her to the river. There, she would sit alone, hidden away, while her brothers worked in the fields. They always came back for her at the end of the day, taking her home when the farming was done. Though they did this to protect her, Swalli hated it. Sitting by the river from dawn till dusk, with nothing to do but stare at the water, made her restless. The sound of the flowing river became her only companion, and the long hours stretched out endlessly. She felt trapped in her own safety, longing for something more, even though she knew she had no choice. Meanwhile, in the royal clan, there was a wealthy man named Chief Ogar. He was powerful and respected, and he had two sons, Samarh and Tegar. They lived a life of luxury, always drinking and feasting. One day, as they sat together, Chief Ogar reminded his sons of the strict rules of Ikenga. The first rule, he said, is that no royal can marry a peasant, and no one is allowed to have a child with a peasant. These are taboos, punishable by death. The sons nodded in agreement, though the weight of the rules seemed far removed from their carefree lives. Later that day, while the peasants labored in the fields under the watchful eyes of the royal armies, Samarh, Tegar, and some other royal boys came to oversee the work. The royal boys, with no compassion for the peasants, began to mock them. Some even beat the workers, taking pleasure in their power. Samarh, however, stood apart from them, quietly observing. The other boys soon grew bored and decided to leave for a drink. They called Samarh to join them, but he refused. "I'll stay here," he said, not wanting to join in their cruelty. As Samarh continued to watch over the field, something caught his eye. A young peasant boy, desperate and hungry, had stolen a piece of fruit. Samarh shouted, startling the boy, who quickly turned and ran. Without thinking, Samarh followed him, curiosity driving his steps. And so began a chase through the farm, one that would soon lead Samarh to a place he never expected, and to a meeting that would change his life, and Swalli's, forever. Samarh chased the young peasant boy through the farm, his heart pounding as the boy disappeared into the distance. Determined not to let him escape, Samarh followed him to an old bridge that stretched over the river. The boy stopped suddenly, and as Samarh reached him, the boy turned and, with a desperate push, sent Samarh tumbling over the side of the bridge. With a loud splash, Samarh plunged into the river below. Panic flooded his mind as he struggled in the water, thrashing helplessly. He couldn't swim, and the river's current was pulling him under. His limbs grew heavier, and soon he felt himself sinking deeper into the cold water, gasping for breath. Swalli, who had been sitting quietly by the riverside, saw it all happen. Her eyes widened in shock as she realized that the young royal was drowning. Without a second thought, she ripped off her dirty smock, dived into the river, and swam with strong, sure strokes toward Samarh. Her hands grasped his arms, pulling him up to the surface with all the strength she had. After what felt like an eternity, Swalli managed to drag Samarh to the shore, laying him gently on the grass. He was barely conscious, water dripping from his face as he gasped for air. Swalli, her heart racing, knelt beside him and began pushing on his chest, trying to help him breathe. "Wake up," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. Samarh coughed and sputtered, his eyes fluttering open. The first thing he saw was Swalli's face, her wet hair clinging to her skin, her eyes filled with concern. For a moment, he was too dazed to understand what had happened. All he knew was that this girl, this peasant, had saved him. Before he could say anything, a voice called out sharply from behind them. "Swalli!" Her brothers had arrived, their faces filled with alarm. They ran toward her, pulling her away from Samarh. Without a word, Swalli stood up and hurried to them, her heart pounding with fear. She didn't dare look back at the royal boy she had just saved. As her brothers led her away, Samarh lay on the ground, still weak and confused. He watched Swalli disappear into the trees, her form growing smaller and smaller until she was gone. Who was she? He wondered. Just then, the sound of marching footsteps filled the air. The king's hands, the royal army, had arrived. They rushed to Samarh's side, pulling him to his feet and quickly escorting him back to the royal grounds. But as they led him away, Samarh couldn't stop thinking about the girl who had saved his life. He had never seen her before, yet something about her lingered in his mind, refusing to let him forget.